Hello, you guys, and welcome back to the Temple Within podcast. I'm your host, Jane Hubbard. Today, we were going to be talking about the will of God and an aspect of God's will where you would ask yourself the question, why does God allow so much evil within the world? That's going to be the main aspect of God's will we're going to be talking about today. Towards the end, we're going to be talking just a little bit about God's will in the sense of you asking the question, what does God want for me to do in this moment? And that's just going to be towards the end of this episode. But the main part of this episode, the majority of this episode, approaching an aspect of God's will where you would ask yourself the question, why does God allow so much evil within the world? And trying to wrap our heads around as much as possible towards the will of God and trying to answer this question. But you have to recognize we're finite people trying to understand an infinite God. So you can only do so much. So keep that in mind. And the first two verses I just want to talk about regarding this aspect of God's will and you, in this sense, asking the question, why does God allow so much evil within the world? And after kind of talking about an aspect of God's will in this sense, then I'll answer that question. But the first two verses I want to read is first Romans 8:28. And that says, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. And then the next verse I want to read is Romans 9:22 through 23. Oh, where is it? In the same way, even though God has the right to show his anger and his power, he is very patient with those on whom his anger falls, who are destined for destruction. He does not do this to make the riches. He does this to make the riches of his glory shine even brighter on those whom he shows mercy, who were prepared in advance for glory. And the main thing these two verses are trying to highlight to us is everything that God does and allows to happen within our lives, in the lives of other people and on this earth, is for his glory and for his purposes. And what are his purposes? His purpose is for as many people to go to be as intimately close with him as possible, and for as many people to be in a relationship with God as possible. And again, with these two verses, Romans 8:28 and Romans 9:23 through 23, the main message, the core principle of these two verses is trying to say to us that everything God does and allows to happen within our lives and the lives of other people and on this earth is for his glory and his purposes. Even though we see all the evil around us, we can look at that evil and say, where is God? It doesn't seem like God is pursuing his purposes with all the evil that's happening, but you have to recognize that within these verses and reassuring yourself and just covering yourself with the nature and character of God, everything that he does and allows is for his glory and his purposes. And some stories or passages in the Bible I just want to read over that highlight this aspect of God's will are first John 5:1 through 14, talking about the healing at the pool. Let me get to that. And this is what John 5:1 through 14 says. It says, afterward, Jesus returned to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish holy days. In the city, near the sheep gate, was the pool of Bethesda, I think that's how you say it, with 5 covered porches. Crowds of sick people, blind, lame, or paralyzed, lay on the porches. One of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him and knew he had been ill for a long time, he asked him, would you like to get well? I can't, sir, the sick man said, for I've no one to put me into the pool when the water bubbles up. Someone else always gets there ahead of me. Jesus told him, stand up, pick up your mat, and walk. Instantly the man was healed. He rolled up his sleeping mat and began to walk. And the rest of the passage goes on, but those are the verses I want to highlight. And with that passage, Like, you have to realize when Jesus went into this pool of this pagan pool, essentially, like, there are so many people that can be healed in that pool. Again, it said the blind, the lame, or paralyzed, like, they were all laying on these porches in this pool. But Jesus, whenever he went in to that pool, he didn't heal all of them. He healed that one man. God could have healed everyone, but chose to heal that one man. And again, like, with God's character and nature, you would expect him to heal everyone. But sometimes in God's will isn't something that we can't comprehend, but it's something we have to accept. And it's through reassuring God's character and nature, do you actually accept fully 100% God's will in certain situations? Because again, like, a lot of us, when going in there, would have just healed everyone because that just seems like the right thing to do. But sometimes God's will isn't to heal everyone, it's to heal just one person. And there's a verse, I'll hint at it a little bit, that I'm eventually going to talk about, and it's Psalms 143:10, and David is basically saying in that verse, teach me to do your will. He's not asking God to teach me to understand your will, because we are, again, finite people trying to understand an infinite God. We can't understand most of the time God's will, at least 100% of the time, God's a full will, like, to the fullest extent of why God allows and does things. And again, looking at John 5:1-14, he could have healed everyone, but he only healed that one man. Another passage I want to read is Luke 5:12. Let me get to that. And it says, in one of the villages, Jesus met a man with an advanced case of leprosy. When the man saw Jesus, he bowed with his face to the ground, begging to be healed. Lord, he said, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. Notice how the man with leprosy says, if you are willing, because the man with leprosy knows it's in the power, it's in God's power, it's in Jesus' power to heal him. But the man is saying, if you are willing, because you have to recognize, like, a lot of the things that we read throughout the Bible, again, with the passages I just read before in John 5, it's in God's power to heal everyone, but is it in God's will to? In that moment, it was only in God's will to heal that one man. And in Luke 5, the man approaches Jesus, and he knows it's in God's power to heal him of leprosy, but he asks him, if you are willing. And if you read along in that passage, he is willing to heal the man. Again, reassuring with ourselves that it's in God's power to do things, but but you have to realize, while it's in God's power to do something, or it's in God's power to do certain things, and like heal the lame and heal all these people, it also has to be in God's will. And with God's will, it's aligned with his purposes. Again, for as many people to be in relationship with him as possible, for as many people to be as intimately close with him as possible. It's always in God's power, but is it in his will? And his will is always going to be pursuing his purpose. And this is the last passage I kind of want to read, talking about the will of God in this aspect. And it's in Luke 1. Let me get to that. If you read Luke 1:6-7, it says, Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous in God's eyes, careful to obey all of the Lord's commandments and regulations. They had no children because Elizabeth was unable to conceive, and they were both very old. So Elizabeth, they were both righteous and on fire for God. But Elizabeth is very old, and she's not able to conceive. Now, if you look at Luke 1:26-34, talking about Mary, it says, in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel, hold on, I need to talk about that. Later in the passage, God allows Elizabeth to be pregnant with a baby, that being John the Baptist, by God's miraculous power and will. So, because the first part of the verse mentioned it, so I just want to mention it also. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a village in Galilee, to a virgin named Mary. She was engaged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. Gabriel appeared to her and said, "Greetings, favored woman, the Lord is with you." Confused and disturbed, Mary tried to think what the angel could mean. "Don't be afraid, Mary," the angel told her, "for you have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be very great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David, and he will reign over Israel forever. His kingdom will never end." Mary asked the angel, "But how can this happen? I am a virgin." So again, with that, the beginning of Luke 1, 6 or 7, Elizabeth is old and she's unable to conceive. But if you look at Luke 1, 26 through 34, and if you look at the evidence of the Bible and just cultural patterns back then, Mary was likely between the ages of 13 and 16 and was a virgin. But at the right time, in God's will, did Elizabeth, at an old age, unable to conceive, be able to conceive, and Mary, at likely around the age of 13 to 16, based on biblical evidence and then just cultural patterns back then, and being a virgin also, she conceived. You have to recognize that sometimes God allows things to happen, sometimes God doesn't allow things to happen. Again, Elizabeth was able to conceive for most of her life until God was willing. Mary, she was only around 13 to 16 years old, likely, and she was a virgin, but in God's will, she conceived Jesus, born of a virgin. And with the main message of all the verses I read, Romans 8:28, Romans 9:20 through 23, the passage in John 5, Luke 5, and Luke 1, it's reassuring the fact that everything God does and allows to happen within our lives and other people's lives is for His glory and His purposes, for people to be as intimately close with Him as possible, and for as many people to be in relationship with Him as possible. And like 99% of the time, we are not going to be able to understand why God allows things to happen and for them not to happen. And attacking the question of why God allows evil within the world, because I think it's a very relevant question with talking about this topic. And again, like, we're finite people trying to understand an infinite God. I fully believe that we should try and comprehend things as much as we can, but let me tell you, there are a lot of things we are never going to be able to fully comprehend. And regarding this question, why does God allow evil within the world? The best answer I could give, and I think anyone can give, is God allows sin to affect the world as much as it does so that His glory may be shown to the world. Because, for example, if the effects of sin weren't upon the world, how can people recognize there's a good God within the world? How can people recognize their need for God if the effects of sin is not affecting us in our lives and other people's lives and within the earth? And that's the best way to answer that question, is to the extent that sin has its effects on the world and in our lives and other people's lives, is so much so to where God's glory is shown through the world and is shown through our lives, and is so much so to where as many people grow to be in a relationship with God and come to God and are as close to God as possible. Now, it is impossible to understand the intricacies of it, because again, we're finite people trying to understand infinite God. You need to come to peace with that. But with answering like these questions, it's a matter of reassuring yourself with God's character and nature, because God absolutely hates sin, and He does everything in His power for people to be as separate from sin as possible. And the more separated you are from sin, the closer you are to God. Or let me rephrase it this way: the closer you are to God, the more separated you are from sin. Now, after talking about this aspect of God's will, in the sense of you asking yourself the question, why does God allow so much evil within the world, talking about God's sovereign will, this is like a little bit of a gear shift in a small aspect of God's will that I just want to talk about. And it's an aspect of God's will where you would ask yourself the question, what does God want me to do in this specific situation? What does God want me to be brought out in this certain situation? And I was listening to a John MacArthur sermon earlier this week, learning about more and more about the will of God when studying for this. And he mentioned a verse that brought me to talk about this aspect of God's will, but you can also apply the principle to what we just talked about in that aspect of God's will. And again, the verse is Psalms 143:10. Let me get to it. And it says, teach me, and David is praying to God and asking God, teach me to do your will, for you are my God. May your gracious spirit lead me forward on a firm footing. Looking at that verse, if you notice, David says, teach me to do your will. He does not say, teach me to understand your will. Now, I'm not saying you should try to understand God's will at times, but your intent behind praying certain prayers and approaching God should not to be wholeheartedly to understand God's will, but to do his will. And I feel like it would be best for me to give an example of this. Whenever I was working out, and again, I was listening to that John MacArthur sermon, and I just heard that verse, and I was like, I'm noting that. I was benching, and whenever I got up from the bench, after I got done with my set, my chain broke, and I was like upset about it. And my first thought was, why God would you allow this? This sucks. And then I immediately had to, correct myself, saying everything God does and allows is, again, with what I talked about, and reassuring myself in that. I was like, this sucks. I'm just gonna, buy a new chain. It's whatever. And as I was going throughout the workout, I started praying to God, is there a reason why that you are willing to tell me as to why my chain broke? And my intent wasn't to understand God's will, but to do his will. Again, I'm not saying it's wrong to pray prayers and approach God and ask him, is there a reason why you allowed this to happen? Help me to if it being your will, help me to understand why this happened. But if not, your will be done. And after praying that, God told me something and told me at least a reason why he allowed that to happen. And again, like something I want to reassure to yourself, with Psalms 143:10, David is praying to God, teach me to do your will, not to understand your will. Again, not to say you shouldn't pray to God and approach God and, ask God, if it being your will, help me to understand why this happened. But whether he tells you or he doesn't, you're at peace with it because you know the will of God is being pursued. Because, again, we're finite people trying to understand an infinite God. We are only able to understand God's will as much as he's willing to tell us the why behind things. And you just have to be at peace with that. And again, through reassuring yourself with God's character and nature, does that truth of everything that God does and allows to happen within our lives and the lives of other people and on this earth is for his glory and his purposes, for as many people to be as close to him as possible, and for as many people to be in relationship with him as possible. Because again, we're not made to be in relationship with the created, we're made to be in relationship with the creator, and he does everything in his will with what he does and allows for people to come to him and grow to be as intimately close with him as possible. I don't know if I'm going to be recording next week. I should be, but I have a pretty busy week next week. I know bits and pieces throughout the last 3 episodes. I've been kind of talking about like my life, essentially. And next Tuesday, I gotta do my physical for the military, redo all that, which I'm so excited for. It's by far the most annoying part of the entire military process. The last time I did my physical, I had to wait like 10 hours, wake up at 3 in the morning, wait for like 10 hours, because it's like 99% waiting, and then the other 1% you're getting your blood drawn, peanut cup, and hearing test, and all these other things. It's super boring, but I'm at least getting the military process, up and going and all that, and likely gonna have to get a waiver for that other thing. And yeah, that's at least where I'm at right now. And then working on that next week. So I'm going to try as best I can to study and record for an episode next week, though. But see you guys. Love you guys. This is Tumble Within podcast. See you guys.